January 28, 1547. The cold dawn light barely touched the frost on the roofs of London when the bells of Westminster began to toll. Their deep, echoing chime carried a message that would shake the foundations of Tudor England. King Henry VIII, the man who had ruled with iron will and shifting tempers for nearly 4 decades, was dead. Yet inside the heart of the palace, behind silks and tapestries, another story began to unfold. A boy just 9 years old was dressing not for lessons or prayers, but for a throne. That child was Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son, the boy who had been raised like a priceless jewel, the heir for whom England had been reshaped through blood, fire, and broken faith. And to understand the horrors, injustices, and brutal decisions tied to his reign, one must begin at the very moment he inherited a kingdom far more dangerous than he could imagine. Edward had been born on October 12, 1537, inside the magnificent walls of Hampton Court Palace. His arrival came at a cost so steep it changed England forever. His mother, Jane Seymour, died only 12 days later due to complications from childbirth. Henry, although devastated, quickly shifted his mind to celebration because, after years of fear and disappointment, he finally had his male heir. Edward was showered with gifts, tutors, servants, the best medical care of the age, and a household built to ensure that his every want and need was met instantly. While daughters were often raised to be obedient and modest, Edward lived inside an insulated world designed to convince him that England existed for him, not the other way around. This deep privilege shaped the boy's thinking long before he touched the crown. From the earliest years, Henry expected his son to behave like a miniature king. The prince had Sill, Klein Chambers, a personal physician, a dedicated schoolmaster, and an army of attendants. Nobles bowed to him as if he were already monarch. When he sneezed, courtiers offered blessings. When he walked, servants moved aside like a living curtain. His toys were carved from fine woods, his clothes embroidered with gold thread, and his books bound in leather. But what he absorbed most was the idea that he was chosen by God, destined to rule, and inherently superior to everyone around him. The boy was intelligent and quick to learn, but he was also fiercely proud, easily offended, and raised without the normal checks that guide a child toward humility. Henry VIII's England was a powder keg when Edward inherited it. Religious tension was spreading like wildfire across Europe, and England was split between Protestant reformers and Catholics, who still yearned for the old faith. The kingdom's finances were strained from wars against France and Scotland. Social unrest simmered due to high taxes and currency inflation. Even the royal court was divided into factions, each hungry for influence over the new, young king. Edward, pampered and sheltered, had no experience with the hardships his people faced. Yet he was about to sit on the throne of a nation desperate for stability, but destined to find more chaos. When Edward became king, he was far too young to rule alone. The real power fell into the hands of his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. Seymour had been close to Henry VIII and believed he alone could guide the realm. He saw his nephew as England's hope for a Protestant future, and believed that religious reform should be pushed aggressively. But England was not ready for the sweeping changes that followed. While Edward gladly supported these reforms, they came with consequences that devastated thousands. Edward loved religious debate. His tutors filled his mind with Protestant doctrine. They praised him when he spoke confidently about faith, and encouraged him to view Catholic traditions as false, dangerous, and backward. In time, the boy king grew rigid in his beliefs, far more severe than even his father had been. For a child raised in luxury, religious purity became a passion far removed from the suffering of ordinary people. And when Somerset began to abolish long-cherished traditions, close monasteries, change church services, and punish those who resisted, Edward not only approved but demanded more. Across England, village churches were stripped of artwork, stained glass, and sacred relics that had stood for centuries. Priests were ordered to follow new rules they barely understood. Many villagers resisted, clinging desperately to the faith of their ancestors. But Edward saw their resistance as defiance against God's will. He wrote about them with cold indifference, calling them stubborn, foolish, and even wicked. This unforgiving nature would later translate into decisions that cost countless lives. Meanwhile, Somerset's government faced growing criticism. England was suffering under the economic pressure of war. Enclosures, the practice where landowners fenced off common fields for sheep farming, pushed poor farmers into starvation. Rebellions erupted in Cornwall, Devon, and Norfolk. Although they rose in response to unjust laws and impossible living conditions, Edward viewed these protesters not as desperate subjects, but as criminals. In his royal journal, he wrote unemotional summaries of the rebellions, never acknowledging the human suffering behind them. His words revealed a chilling lack of empathy, shaped by a childhood where every need was instantly met. Somerset's power began to crumble. His political enemies gathered around John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, who saw opportunity in chaos. Dudley was cunning, ambitious, and more politically skilled. He promised Edward a more forceful Protestant agenda, something the young king welcomed. The court shifted. Somerset was arrested. Dudley rose, and Edward, shielded from the darker political games of his advisers, believed that all of this was happening simply because God favored the path he approved of. As Edward grew older, his sense of entitlement deepened. His writings show a boy convinced that morality and authority were tied entirely to his religious beliefs. Anyone who resisted Protestant reform, even peacefully, was labeled an enemy of truth. His reign began to move England toward a kind of enforced obedience where dissent was not tolerated. And the boy king, sitting in ornate chambers with velvet cushions and silver goblets, saw none of the suffering caused by these policies. Yet the most horrifying part of Edward's rule was how he reacted when he believed his own legitimacy or authority was threatened. He endorsed harsh punishments, demanded unwavering loyalty, and manipulated the royal succession to prevent anyone who did not share his beliefs from taking the throne. Even at such a young age, Edward's influence shaped events that would lead to imprisonment, executions, and national turmoil. The story of Edward VI is not simply about a child on a throne. It is about how unchecked power, religious zeal, and privilege can combine to create decisions that reverberate through generations. What came next during his brief but impactful reign would plunge England into one of the most dramatic succession crises in its history, and the consequences of his choices would haunt the Tudor dynasty long after his death. The summer of 1549 should have been a season of warmth and harvest across England, but instead the kingdom found itself rising in anger, fear, and desperation. Edward VI had been on the throne for just over 2 years. Though still a child, his signature and approval appeared on every royal order, law, and proclamation. At 9, he had inherited a troubled kingdom. At 11, he already believed he was chosen by God to correct it. And by 12, the people of England would feel the consequences of his rigid beliefs and sheltered upbringing. To understand the horrors tied to Edward's reign, one must look closely at the rebellions that erupted in 1549. They were not small uprisings. They were the loud cries of starving peasants, overtaxed farmers, unemployed labourers, and ordinary villagers whose lives had been overturned by government policies. Yet to Edward, they were simply rebels, enemies of order, and obstacles to his vision of a religiously purified England. The first sign of trouble began in Devon and Cornwall, where villagers gathered in protest against the new prayer book imposed by the Protestant government. The Book of Common Prayer, written in English instead of Latin, was meant to unify church services across the realm. But to many, especially in the West where older traditions survived strongly, this was a violent attack on their faith. Priests were forced to discard familiar rites. Altars were torn down. Images of saints were destroyed. To simple villagers, these changes came too quickly, pushed by men in London who barely understood their lives. Their demands were clear. They wanted the old Mass restored. They wanted priests to return to Latin liturgy. They wanted the crown to stop trampling their sacred customs. Instead of addressing these concerns, the government treated the people as traitors. Edward wrote in his journal about the unrest in cold, detached lines, describing the rebels as ignorant and wicked. There was no mention of their poverty, their fear, or their desperation. What followed was one of the bloodiest crackdowns in Tudor history. The government sent Lord Russell with a force of German and Italian mercenaries. Fighting broke out in places like Samford Courtenay, Fenny Bridges, and Clyst Heath. Thousands lost their lives. Entire villages were devastated. At Clyst St. Mary, prisoners were executed in brutal fashion because the government feared they would escape or rise again. The scale of suffering was enormous, yet Edward saw only the triumph of royal authority. His diary entry for the event was chillingly short, celebrating the suppression as a necessary act of justice. But the worst was yet to come. In Norfolk, a different kind of rebellion rose under the leadership of a tanner named Robert Kett. Unlike the West Country uprising, this one was driven not by religion, but by economic injustice. Landlords were seizing common lands, fencing them off for sheep farming, and pushing poor families into starvation. The prices of goods soared, wages collapsed. Even the coinage was debased as Somerset's government melted silver coins and added cheaper metals to produce more money, leading to rapid inflation. Kett and thousands of others gathered at Mousehold Heath near Norwich, forming a vast, organized camp. They demanded fair rents, honest local officials, and an end to enclosures. Although the rebels remained relatively peaceful and even attempted negotiations, Edward viewed them through the same rigid lens. They were lawbreakers, troublemakers, challenges to his perfect vision of order. Their suffering did not soften his stance. Once again a royal army marched. Led by John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, the forces clashed with the rebels at Dussindale. The rebel army was poorly armed and lacked formal training. The defeat was devastating. Thousands lay dead on the fields. Kett was captured, tortured, and hung in chains from the walls of Norwich Castle. Edward's reaction, a brief note in his journal that the rebellion had been resolved. No sorrow, no awareness of the blood spilled across England because of policies he supported. His sheltered upbringing, constant praise, and shielded lifestyle had created a king who could not connect with the suffering of his own people. Meanwhile, the political earthquake inside the court shook violently. Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset and the Protector, began to lose support. He had made too many enemies, issued too many unpopular reforms, and failed to control the chaos tearing England apart. His greatest mistake, however, was believing he held the boy king's complete loyalty. In private, the young Edward had grown impatient with Somerset's compromises. He wanted stronger measures against Catholics. He wanted more control, and he found a new hero in John Dudley. Dudley played his role brilliantly. He flattered the boy king, telling him he was wise beyond his age, divinely guided, and destined to be England's greatest ruler. Edward believed every word. In Dudley, he saw the man who would push England into a more aggressive Protestant future. Somerset was arrested, charged with many questionable offences, and though his eventual execution came later, his fall from power in 1049 marked a turning point in Edward's character. For the first time, the young king had participated in the destruction of a man who had loved and raised him, and his writings suggest he felt more satisfaction than guilt. With Somerset gone, John Dudley rose rapidly, becoming the Duke of Northumberland. The court shifted around him. Policies hardened. Protestant reform accelerated. Edward's rigid beliefs were now backed by a man far more ruthless than Somerset. Edward's personal writings grew even colder. He recorded executions like one jotting simple tasks. He dismissed the old religion with contempt. He saw God's favour in every victory and punishment for every defeat. Yet outside the palace, ordinary people continued to suffer. Inflation rose even higher. Poverty spread across London and the countryside. Crime rates surged. Hunger became common in areas where enclosures had destroyed traditional farming life. One of the most horrifying aspects of Edward's reign was his obsession with religious conformity. He believed it was his sacred duty to cleanse the kingdom of anything that resembled the old Catholic order. Under his influence, churches were further stripped. Priests who resisted were imprisoned. Bishops who disagreed with reforms were removed, and when his half-sister Mary refused to abandon the Catholic Mass within her own household, Edward was enraged. He felt betrayed, insulted, challenged. He demanded that she conform or face consequences. The fact that she was his elder half-sister, the daughter of Henry VIII's first marriage, carried no weight in his mind. To Edward, disobedience was treason against both crown and God. This hard, unbending attitude would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic succession crises in English history. Yet while Edward's beliefs grew harsher, his body began to weaken. The year 1552 marked the beginning of his steady decline. He developed a deep cough, feverish sweats, and fatigue that no physician could cure. His illness, likely a combination of tuberculosis and other infections, slowly consumed him. But even as he weakened, the boy king made decisions that would change the fate of England. Under Northumberland's guidance and with his own unforgiving beliefs pushing him, Edward drafted a new plan for the royal succession, a plan that would override the rights of his half-sisters, a plan that would plunge England into chaos, a plan that revealed just how dangerous a sheltered and rigid child king could become when handed absolute power. When Section 3 begins, the story turns toward Edward's final months, his most shocking decisions, and the horrifying legacy his short reign left behind. By early 1553, the royal physicians could no longer hide the truth. Edward VI was dying. The boy who had once been the prized heir of Henry VIII, pampered beyond imagination, sheltered behind silk curtains, and raised to believe he was chosen by God, was fading rapidly. His cough deepened into a rasp that rattled his thin chest. His hands trembled. His appetite vanished. His body, once strong from daily lessons, archery practice, and long walks in the palace gardens, shrank under the weight of fever and weakness. But what made Edward's final months horrifying were not just the physical details of his decline. It was the decisions he made while drifting ever closer to death, decisions that would plunge England into a constitutional crisis, tear the Tudor dynasty apart, and send innocent people to the scaffold. For Edward, illness did not soften his beliefs. If anything, it sharpened them. He had been raised to see the world in absolute terms, right and wrong, godly and ungodly, Protestant and Catholic. As his body weakened, his sense of divine purpose grew stronger. He believed he was responsible not only for ruling England, but for rescuing its soul before he died. And in his mind, there was no greater threat to England's spiritual future than his half-sister Mary. Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was a devout Catholic. She had endured humiliation during Henry VIII's marriage crisis, been declared illegitimate, later restored, and then tolerated at court. But she never abandoned the faith she had been born into. For Edward, who saw Catholicism as a false and corrupt system, Mary's devotion was intolerable. The thought of a Catholic queen sitting on the throne after him troubled him deeply. He wrote about Mary's refusal to abandon the Mass with anger and disappointment. To him, she was not a sister or a royal princess. She was a threat, a danger to the godly reforms he believed England needed, a link to the past he had been raised to hate. And as his illness worsened, his fear of what might happen after his death grew more desperate. It was during this vulnerable period that John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, made his move. Northumberland was no fool. He knew Edward would not live long. He also knew that if Mary became queen, everything he had built would collapse. His political enemies would return to power. His influence would disappear. And it was likely he would face imprisonment or death. He needed a plan to protect himself and the Protestant reforms he had championed. That plan centered on a young woman named Lady Jane Grey. Jane was Edward's cousin, the granddaughter of Henry VII's daughter Mary. She had been raised in a strict Protestant household, highly educated, fluent in languages, and known for her intelligence. She was also deeply religious and unwavering in her beliefs. To Northumberland, she was the perfect replacement for Mary. Young, impressionable, Protestant, and connected by blood to the Tudor line. But there was a problem. The lawful succession had already been decided by Henry VIII himself. According to Henry's will, if Edward died without children, the crown would pass to Mary, and if Mary died without heirs, then to Elizabeth. This plan had been approved by Parliament and embedded in English law. Yet to Edward, law meant little compared to religious conviction. He believed that God would not allow a Catholic to rule England. He convinced himself that Mary's rightful place in the succession was irrelevant because she belonged to an ungodly faith. And so, even as he struggled to breathe, he began to dictate a new succession plan. This document, known as My Device for the Succession, was Edward's most significant and most dangerous act. It bypassed Mary entirely. It bypassed Elizabeth as well, partly because she was considered politically uncertain and partly because she, too, carried the stain of illegitimacy from her mother's downfall. Instead, Edward declared that the throne should go to the Lady Jane and her heirs male. The wording revealed both his prejudices and his desperation. He wanted a Protestant monarch. He also wanted the security of a male heir at some point. Jane herself was considered unimportant except as a vessel for continuing the Protestant line. This was not a decision rooted in affection for Jane or concern for England's stability. It was rooted in Edward's rigid upbringing and his belief that God demanded his kingdom remain Protestant at all costs. Northumberland seized the opportunity. He arranged the marriage of Lady Jane Grey to his own son, Guildford Dudley. This created the appearance of a unified Protestant future and secured his family's position at the centre of power. The marriage took place only weeks before Edward's health collapsed entirely, a clear sign that the political games at court had reached their most dangerous stage. As the spring of 1553 passed, Edward's condition worsened dramatically. His coughing fits left him gasping for air. He lost so much weight that ambassadors described him as a ghost. His hair thinned. His skin grew pale. Physicians applied leeches, herbal poultices, and heated plasters, but nothing helped. Some believed he had tuberculosis. Others suspected a mix of infections worsened by an already frail constitution. Yet even while dying, Edward clung fiercely to the succession plan he had crafted. He summoned judges, nobles, and councillors, insisting they sign the document. Many hesitated, knowing it violated Henry VIII's legal acts and could lead to civil war, but Edward pressured them with the authority of a king who believed he was carrying out God's will. Eventually they yielded, fearing punishment or hoping to gain royal favour. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. His reign had lasted only 6 years, yet his decisions had set in motion a crisis that would shape England's future. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen on July 10. Bells rang. Heralds announced the news. Edward's carefully crafted plan was now reality. But across the country, support for Mary grew rapidly. England had not forgotten her as Henry's firstborn daughter. Many believed she was the rightful heir. Others feared the chaos of overturning the legal succession. Still, others disliked the Dudley family and saw Jane as their puppet. Mary fled, rallied her supporters, and within days, thousands marched under her banner. Nobles defected from Jane's side. Soldiers switched allegiance. Ordinary villagers and townspeople shouted Mary's name. Within 9 days, the young woman Edward had selected to rule England was deposed. Jane Grey was arrested, her husband Guildford Dudley was arrested, Northumberland, the mastermind behind the plot, was executed. Jane, though merely a victim of circumstance, would eventually face the axe as well. And it all traced back to Edward, the sheltered boy king. The child raised to believe God had given him absolute authority. The ruler whose rigid beliefs and privileged upbringing pushed him to override the lawful succession and create a national crisis. His death did not end the turmoil he caused. Instead, it opened the door to Mary's reign, which brought its own brutal chapters, including the Marian persecutions. The kingdom Edward sought to shape in purity became a battleground of faith and power. His decisions haunted England for generations. In Section 4, the final part of this story, we explore the aftermath of Edward's actions, the long-term consequences for England and the Tudor dynasty, and how history came to view this young king who left behind a legacy far darker than most imagine. When King Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, England entered a storm far greater than anything the boy king had ever imagined while signing decrees from his velvet-lined chambers. His short life, marked by privilege, rigid beliefs, and an unshakable sense of divine certainty, set off a chain reaction that reshaped the Tudor dynasty, altered England's religious landscape, and left behind consequences that echoed for generations. Although he reigned only 6 years, the havoc he unleashed through his final decisions proved more lasting than the policies of monarchs who ruled far longer. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The council declared Lady Jane Grey Queen on July 10, fulfilling the device for the succession Edward had pushed for during his final days. But the kingdom was not persuaded. Jane's rise was not viewed as a smooth transition, but as a suspicious scheme orchestrated by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Rumours spread rapidly through London markets, taverns, and churches. People whispered that Dudley had forced Edward to rewrite the succession, that the dying king had been manipulated, that the device was illegal, and while some admired Jane's piety and learning, far more questioned why Henry VIII's daughters had been cast aside. Mary Tudor acted swiftly. She fled to East Anglia, the heart of her family's loyal supporters. From there she rallied nobles, knights, and commoners alike. Thousands answered her call. Messages spread across the countryside like wildfire. Farmers abandoned fields. Townsmen armed themselves. Even former supporters of Edward's reforms joined her cause, not out of love for Catholicism, but because they saw her as the rightful heir. The tide turned with incredible speed. Within 9 days, Jane's reign crumbled. The same council that had declared her queen now abandoned her and declared Mary rightful sovereign. This dramatic collapse exposed the fragility and recklessness of Edward's plan. The boy king, in his desperation to shape England's religious future, underestimated the deep respect his people still held for legitimate succession. To Edward, faith determined worth and authority, but to England lineage, law, and tradition mattered far more. Mary entered London on August 3, 1553, greeted by cheers, banners, and celebrations. Yet hidden beneath that joy lay the shadow of Edward's decisions. His attempt to prevent Mary from ruling had enraged her. It had threatened her life. It had nearly robbed her of her birthright. And Mary, now queen, was determined to restore everything Edward had destroyed. One of Mary's first actions was to dismantle Edward's religious policies. Churches were allowed once again to display images, celebrate Mass, and restore traditional forms of worship. Latin returned. Altars were rebuilt. Priests who had fled in fear now walked confidently through their parishes. For the common people who had never accepted the rapid Protestant changes, this felt like a return to normal. But for those who had embraced Edward's reforms, it felt like a punishment. Mary's fury was not limited to religious changes. She also took aim at those who had supported Edward's device. Northumberland was executed. His sons were imprisoned, and although Jane Grey had played no active role in political plotting, her existence as a Protestant figurehead made her dangerous. In the winter of 1554, after Wyatt's rebellion threatened Mary's rule, Jane and Guildford were executed. Their deaths became yet another tragic consequence of Edward's hardline beliefs and his stubborn refusal to follow lawful succession. Yet the most lasting consequence of Edward's reign was the intensity of Mary's religious retaliation. Edward had pushed Protestant reforms with speed and severity. Mary responded with equal fervour in the opposite direction. Her campaign to restore Catholicism resulted in the Marian persecutions, in which nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. Bishops like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer suffered agonizing deaths for refusing to abandon the doctrines Edward had helped entrench. These burnings forever damaged Mary's reputation and earned her the infamous title by which she is still remembered, Bloody Mary. Ironically, Mary's brutal reaction ensured the eventual triumph of Protestantism. When she died in 1558 and Elizabeth I took the throne, the English people were exhausted by religious violence. They had seen too much bloodshed under both Edward and Mary. Elizabeth used that fatigue to create a new religious settlement that took a more moderate, stable approach. Thus, Edward's rigid policies and Mary's harsh countermeasures laid the foundation for Elizabethan Protestantism, which would dominate English culture for centuries. The legacy Edward left behind was complicated and rarely favorable. Historians often debated how much responsibility should be placed on him personally. He was, after all, a child, but his writings revealed a frightening level of self-righteousness, a coldness toward suffering, and a willingness to override justice for religious purity. He saw rebellion not as a cry for help, but as rebellion against God. He viewed his sisters not as family but as obstacles, and in his final act he tried to reshape the monarchy according to belief rather than law, a precedent that could have destroyed the Tudor line entirely. Even the reforms he supported had unintended consequences. The dissolution of chantries, the destruction of religious art, and the removal of ancient traditions created resentment in communities where religion had been woven into daily life. Economic policies under his rule deepened poverty. His inability to see beyond privilege prevented him from understanding the struggles of the people he ruled. England during Edward's reign suffered famines, unemployment, and instability, yet his diaries rarely mentioned hardship, except to condemn those who protested it. Despite this, there were people at court who admired Edward. Some praised his intelligence, noting he could read Latin, Greek, and French. Others claimed he was earnest, devout, and serious beyond his years. But these traits, when combined with absolute power and no experience of real suffering, became dangerous. They resulted in a ruler who believed he understood the will of God better than anyone around him. Edward's death at 15 left behind no heroic story, no great military campaign, no golden age of prosperity. Instead, it left England shaken, divided, and bleeding from the wounds of religious conflict. His reign acted as a bridge between two dangerous extremes, each fueled by the fire of belief rather than the wisdom of compromise. And in that fire, innocent people burned, both figuratively during his own policies and literally during the persecutions that followed. As history judged him, Edward became known not as a boy king with potential, but as a ruler whose sheltered upbringing and strict ideological training produced tyranny without awareness. He did not intend cruelty. He did not seek bloodshed, but his inability to see beyond his privileged world caused suffering on a scale he never understood. Yet his story remains one of the most important lessons in English history. It shows how absolute power in the hands of a child, raised without empathy and taught to believe he was chosen by God, can create consequences far greater than any sword, rebellion, or foreign threat. It underscores how dangerous religious extremism can be when tied to political authority, and it highlights the fragile balance a kingdom must keep between tradition, law, and belief. Edward VI ruled for 6 years. He lived for 15, but the turmoil he unleashed lasted far longer. His decisions shaped the fates of queens, destroyed families, triggered executions, and influenced the future of England's religion and monarchy. His reign was a brief spark that ignited a firestorm, and the smoke of that fire drifted across the Tudor dynasty for decades.